It was so quiet out here.
First Avenue Northeast. This was around 1905. So I think John will start there and continue. A little encouragement.
Well, thank you, Marcella. Hi, neighbors.
Hi, John.
Often I get to see all my neighbors. Let me say a word about Marcella. I've known Marcella ever since she lived out on 27th Street, and you'll all be glad to know that in exactly, I would think almost exactly, 48 hours, Marcella is going to receive a Distinguished Community Service Award.
Wonderful.
The Cedar Rapids Area Peaceful Justice Network is honoring her.
Wonderful.
And of course, all people are calling me up and saying, well, I need to know more about Marcella and her background. And we can't ask her directly, you know, so we have all these wonderful rumors that we're starting about Marcella.
Well, John, we always knew we lived amongst beautiful people.
Yeah.
And this is kind of nice to know we now have one more added to the list.
You do indeed. Well, this is one time when I am uniquely qualified to speak on what I'm going to speak on. I was born in the house immediately next door, that direction, and I spent the first 18 years of my life in that house growing up, and then for 4 years away at college, and then 4 more years for war effort. But in late 1945, I returned. And this time, I with a wife, we moved into this house with my parents. And as she used to say, if you think your mother-in-law is bad, you ought to see mine. Because we had moved away, we had given up living in Worcester, Massachusetts, where her roots were, because I insisted that we come back to Cedar Rapids. And it was a little sticky, though, living there, so we didn't want to stay there in the house, although it was big enough for us. So we looked around, and there was nowhere to rent or to live, or no building materials in 1945. There just weren't any. And my grandfather innocently said, well, if you want to fix up my barn, you can live there. And we turned up our noses at the idea, but in desperation, we finally knuckled under. And then, we were only going to live there 2 years and build on our own house, but, you know, we never got around to moving. And that was 49 years ago. So, we are your neighbors. We just live this direction. About what, 100 yards, 300 feet?
Oh, nothing more.
It's close.
About 900.
But I have difficulty keeping up with all the people here. One year when I was in the legislature and very busy and holding down 2 jobs, I said to a friend here, and I forget who it was, why don't you tell your friends there at Blair House that they can have little garden plots where we have our garden, because we're too busy to do gardening this year. And gee, one summer night I went out to see how things were, and wow, here's the superintendent of the Cedar Rapids Community School District and his hands and knees cultivating some tomatoes, and next to him the president of the People's Bank. Why, right here in my front yard. And I did find out that both of them were at the time living upstairs here.
That was Ted Welch.
Ted Welch it was. And I forget who the superintendent was, but this is where he lived. I remember.
Ted Welch.
Yes, he had a whole flock of kids, and they used to all walk out on the way on Sundays to church. Anyway, that's about as far as I get. Because, you see, you've got an enclosed way into your garage. You get into your cars, and out you go, and that's all I see. It's just the car, not the inhabitants or occupants. You're here to find more about this general locus in this area, and particularly the very interesting house that sat on the site. And this is quite a story in and of itself, so I feel as though really I'm not presuming on you to share some of the memories and knowledge that I have about this place. It was owned and built by my grandfather. And his name was John Stoney Ely. And he liked that number, 2222. And what happened was, when the Elys first came to Cedar Rapids, 2 years before Iowa became a state, the first one was persuaded to come because George Green, the founder of Cedar Rapids, needed a grain miller. And somebody that could build a mill and grind grain so he wouldn't have to cart it in by ox cart, and the whole community would be more self-sufficient. Well, his young wife, he sent her out to kind of scout the place over, and she fell in love with it by looking out roughly where the Grace Episcopal Church is, and she fell in love with Cedar Rapids. Her husband didn't like it. He said, "This is a pestilential climate, and as soon as I'm out of debt, I'm going to move away." And he was right about the pestilential climate, because he was dead in 2 years. But to induce him to come, George Green had offered him 1/12 of the town site. And that's the reason for the wealth. The widow, and she was not even 30 when she inherited 1/12 of all the land of Cedar Rapids. Her brother-in-law came to settle the estate, and more than anything, by way of convenience, she married him. So in effect, she married two Ely brothers. And it was the second brother, named John, that for whom I'm named. So as a matter of fact, the first male Ely of each generation has been named John, going back quite a ways. I'm the 8th, my son's the 9th, and my grandson, who already has 6 nephews and nieces that are older than he is, was just born last November. That's John Ely the 10th. So there's quite a line here. Well, all my grandfather did, and he had 8 or 9 brothers and sisters. Every one of them died in childbirth, except for him. He lived to be 96 and died in his lovely home that's right here on this site. And of course, he inherited his mother's property, and all he did was sell it off and live the life of Riley. He retired at the ripe old age of 34. And although he maintained an office, he wouldn't go down, he'd go down a couple of hours a day. But back in the time when he was employed, he was the president of the street railway system, which was the Cedar Rapids and Marion Street Railway System, which was all the streetcars. And I forget all the other things he was in, but mainly it was real estate. Well, he was born in the dead center of downtown Cedar Rapids, about where Armstrong's sporting goods store is. In fact, that's where Ginsberg's Jewelers are remodeling. They're going to move in there. That's where the family home was. And then when he married and he had his own home, that was up, he moved quite a ways out, way up to 6th Street and 2nd Avenue, where the Gazette's parking ramp is. And then he decided he wanted to really get out of downtown, so he looked around and he chose the best place he knew of in Cedar Rapids, which is right here. And when he bought the land from 21st Street right through, and he always regretted that he didn't buy all the land right through to 24th Street. But you can see from the way A Avenue was configured what he did. He just said to the city, I don't want any street bumping into my land. So there isn't any A Avenue. It just comes and stops abruptly and then starts again farther down. He wanted a lot of land and a big place, and he had it. And that's why, ultimately, it was so attractive for the developer who started this big complex here, because there was a lot of space. And it was relatively convenient, located right along what was then Iowa's busiest street. First Avenue was Iowa's busiest street. Well, that's how it all started. When his children came along, he said, well, I believe in strong family ties. Tell you what, if you'll build your house, I'll give you the land, if you'll build it right next to mine. So my father was the oldest child, and he built his house right there. And then his sister, when she got married, for a while they lived on B Avenue, just below, between 23rd and 24th. But they built the house right over here, just around the corner. The corner was empty for a long time. And the sister married somebody named Simmons. The name is remembered in Cedar Rapids because it's the Simmons of Simmons Perrine, what was for many years the largest law firm in Cedar Rapids. Only when I was young, it was called Simmons. It was called Truan, Simmons, and Truan. There were Truan, Judge Truan, and his son, and Haven Simmons was sandwiched right in the middle of the firm. Well, so when I came along, there were these three houses. There was the big house here, our house there, and my aunt and uncle and three cousins across the backyard beyond the hemlock trees. Well, that's where we all grew up. And this grandfather always believed that he wanted to have a tight family relationship. He loved to play golf, and he and his good friend George Bruce Douglas started the first golf course in the town. It was located starting out at the corner of 19th Street and 1st Avenue. Well, they didn't like that very well, and George wanted the land, or the Sinclairs wanted the land because they wanted to build a house. No sooner did they do that than Mr. Sinclair lost his life falling down the elevator shaft in his packing plant. So eventually the Sinclairs traded with the Douglases, and the Douglases moved out of their house, which was then what is now Turner's Mortuary, out to Brucelawn. And then the Sinclairs moved into that house down there on 2nd Avenue and 8th Street. Well, all this is a long way of saying that when I came along, here was this big house next door, and everybody in the area kowtowing to this imperious grandfather who had all this money. As I say, he enjoyed life to the greatest. When the Panama Canal was built, somebody got the bright idea of having round-the-world cruises. And boy, he just had to sign up for the first ship to sail around the world, and he did. Through the Panama Canal when it was opened in I think it was 1913 or 1914. He always wintered in Honolulu, but then in his older age, he pulled back, and they just had their winters in Pasadena. Well, the house sat empty there during the winter, and I got to know the house very well because somebody had to shovel all the sidewalk from the property line over here clear down to 21st Street, because there wasn't anything in the block between 21st Street and 22nd Street. And I think I was paid the enormous sum of 35 cents for shoveling that whole long stretch. And I only weighed 90 pounds when I was in junior high school. And it really was a little presuming to expect that much from some kid. But, you know, the work ethic was going strong. When you simply directed your child to do it, and the child said yes and did it. So, yeah.
Did you fire the furnace too when your family?
No. The house when the house was really wound up and going in the summer, it had a staff of 5.
Mm-hmm.
And the houseman was the only one that was there for the full 12 months every day. And that was just the houseman. That's what he was called. His name was Sam Ross. He started out as the Douglases' coachman.
Oh.
But he didn't like the Douglases because they drank too much liquor. And if you know the story about the Douglases, yes, they were all alcoholics. And so he left their employ, and there was strained relations when he came to work for my grandfather because, of course, George B. Douglas wanted to know, well, what are you doing, stealing my employees? And, well, no, he came to me first. Anyway, he was the houseman. Then there was the cook and the second girl. The second girl was the one that had to do the cleaning and make the beds. And then the gardener, but the gardener was only there during the summer when you could raise vegetables. And finally the chauffeur. And the chauffeur was, you always doubled in those days. The chauffeur that I knew best was a college student at Coe College. And after he graduated from Coe, all of a sudden it was the Depression, and he wanted to be a doctor very much. So, and one day he came to my grandfather and said, well, I just can't make it. I finished 1 year of medical school, but I'm going to have to go back to work or something. And my grandfather said, nonsense, Robert. You're going to go right back down and continue your education. I'm going to pay for it. Well, years later, this was Bob Ray, Dr. Bob Ray, the orthopedist. And I remember him telling me this little incident. I never knew about Bob's medical career at all until one day our children were having their flat feet examined, and Bob told us the story about my grandfather. The house, I'd best go to the house. And by the way, do feel free to cut in anytime and ask about something detailed. I've recently run across the floor plans for the house. The house had 4 floors. It was designed by a Chicago architect named Lawrence Buck. Apparently he was one of America's better architects because there was an architectural firm that was doing research on his life. The young architects in the firm are putting out a biography of this man. Of course, they wanted to know, do you have any pictures of the house? Which is these pictures. There's a lot more of them, but I don't know where they are. I don't know if I got them all back. Anyway, they simply didn't know much about a house, but they thought he would. So the astonishing thing about it, as I look about these plans, is that they weren't changed. They simply said, well, you know about houses, build us a house, and he did, in a big way. It was my privilege, not long ago, to go through the Biltmore estate. This is that big one outside the Vanderbilts built outside of Asheville, North Carolina. Well, and it's a huge estate. It's, of course, one of the most famous ones, along with places like the Breakers up in Rhode Island. But in going through it, the two were built about the same time, so you saw all the same plumbing in this great Vanderbilt home. And so much was the same, it was almost uncanny as this house. The house was 4 floors. I'll briefly describe them. The basement was long and narrow, and it had a single basement way that was just great if you wanted to shoot a .22 rifle. What you did, you took the chopping block, and every house, of course, was heated by coal, and to start the coal fire in the furnace, and this house was so big it had 2 furnaces, and it had a huge coal room. It took about 12 wagon loads of coal to fill up the coal room to keep the thing warm, just to keep it from freezing, because, of course, the family was off in Pasadena or Honolulu. And so there was this long place that you set up your targets against the chopping block, and you set a table, and you fired your .22 rifle and learned how to be an accurate shooter in the basement of this place. Well, coming off, there was the big boiler room where the 2 furnaces were, and then the coal room, and then a room for the wood, and lots of wood. Now the family owned, my grandmother inherited a great deal of property that, let's see, which edition is it? Well, go over to Shaver Park. You know where Shaver Park is? Well, all the wooded area that's now developed was a great farm that she owned. So all the wood that was needed from about 5 or 6 acres all came from there. So they would hire a crew in the winter to cut down trees and split them up, and you hired a portable sawmill to cut all into fireplace lengths. Of course, they had fireplaces all over this house, and lots of wood. So you had the wood room to keep the wood in good shape down in the basement. Then you had the preserves room, and then you had the vegetable cellar. Vegetable cellar was where you put all the potatoes and covered them so that they wouldn't mold, and you'd have potatoes all year round. And then there were the compressor room, which was something added later, and that was to work the huge refrigerator. You ought to see that refrigerator. It had 6 doors to it, and the center one was where the ice was. The ice was put in from the outdoors. It was a little set of stairs especially, and lots of ice when you put it in. And you put in about 6 or 7 blocks of 50 pounds of block ice, and then it was supposed to circulate around the whole thing and keep everything cool. But later, you see, they got electricity and compressors. That was taken care of. But the compressor was also used to power the alternating current to diesel current, because my grandmother had an electric. Electric, what's that? Well, it's an electric automobile. And they were these funny things. They were very heavy, and they were shaped like this and came up to a kind of a cab. But it was a crazy looking thing with doors in it. And the women all liked it because there wasn't a steering wheel. There was a lever, and you steered with this lever. And all you had to do was push a button, and it started going, and you push another button, it would go a little faster, and that was about it. 2 buttons forward, 2 in reverse, and a steering lever. But you had to charge up the batteries. They were very heavy. They were heavier than automobiles are today because of all the storage batteries they had to lug around. But it was good enough to drive all the way from here downtown and back before you recharged, or to go off and have tea with somebody. And that was very nice because you could drive this creation. The garage at one end, if you jockeyed things right, Mr. Buck didn't design the door right. A fairly narrow garage door, but once you got inside, it was wide. And you could put 2 cars down one side and 2 down the other side. So the whole thing would hold 4 cars, but you could only get one through the garage door at a time. Well, then there was the laundry room. There were 2 laundry rooms. There was a whole room with a whole lot of tubs, and you had all these portable wringer things, and you had all this hand stuff. And, well, there was a lot of work to be done, but there was a lot of space to do it in. But it was just kind of nice because it was a high basement. The basement windows were only, they went down about this high, so it wasn't, you weren't down below the ground level very far. Well, going upstairs, that was quite a place. You entered the house from a porte cochere. I'll pass this around because the drawing gives an idea of the layout. And as far as I can see, this building sits right smack where the house sat. And this blueprint gives an idea. And I'll just pass it around. You can see the sweep of the driveway. And the driveway it didn't come into First Avenue straight on, perpendicular at all. That was because the house was built on the road to the county seat, which was Marion. And nobody went out there, that far. And everybody you see was aimed toward downtown. So they slanted the driveway downtown. It was difficult if you ever went uptown to try and come out of the slanted driveway and hook way around and go. In later years, of course, it became a big thoroughfare, and that's the way you did. The driveway entered just where the walkway is now. That's why the walkway is where it is. That's the little sidewalk that goes through, and you see that opening. If you look at it carefully, you can see where a driveway had been there. And the walk coming down to First Avenue, or on the other part, is where your driveway is now, going into First Avenue. So the 2 were just reversed. it's a much more intelligent layout now than it was then. However, this great thing came up under a porte-cochere. You got out, you went up steps. It wasn't handicap accessible at all. And then in you came into a nice room, which, well, kind of just a big room that where there was nice furniture, except really no function. It was between the living room and the dining room. But here was this grand staircase, and it was a big, wide staircase, a beautiful banister, and no obstructions, so that a little kid like me could start at the very top and slide down, and it was parallel on the landing for quite a ways. And then the final stretch was down the rest of the way. I used to love to slide that banister as a child. And of course, when my aunt was married, the youngest child of the 4 children was married, and she just has had her 98th birthday. She was married coming down this great staircase, you see. Then, let's see, to that way, there was the living room. It was a great big living room. It's shown here in this picture, which I'll pass around. Fireplace, bookcases lining the rooms, glass, nice furniture, lovely furniture. The family, let's see, my grandmother would go to Boston to buy furniture. She got some beautiful pieces. There's a highboy that it always struck me how interesting it was that the old craftsmen knew how to make highboys and bureaus, that the drawers worked fine, no matter what the humidity was. And the little doors always worked, and the small drawers worked. Nothing ever stuck with one of these. The lovely piece that was right there when you went in the front door it was given to the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. It's in storage, I think, in the basement. Sometimes that's going to be brought out, and you're going to all be able to see it when there's an exhibit, a furniture exhibit here in Cedar Rapids. Well, beyond that, there was a summer veranda with tile floor, and when they went around the world, they bought bamboo curtains, and they would roll down. There was lots of shade trees, lots of elm trees all over the property. Well, that was kind of nice. And then back of the living room, on that side of the house, was a library. It's a gorgeous library, and lots of books. And there was one of those globes, you know, that stands on a stand, and you can spin the thing and look and see where different countries are. Well, and a writing desk where bills could be paid and stuff like that. Then on the other side, I'm going this way, a huge dining room. When the family would have a Thanksgiving dinner, you had 2 or 3 turkeys. And my grandfather was always up to it. I mean, he'd carve one turkey and then carve another one and all the stuffing, and you had 30 and 40 people. You see, this great big dining room table, plus a few auxiliary tables around for youngsters. The children were all off together, you know how it was with these family affairs. Well, then there was a lovely breakfast nook, which I think you can see in one of those. They loved to have their breakfast in this nook that was covered with, surrounded by windows. You could look out on the lovely lawn and stuff. And a fireplace in the dining room. But this was the part that really got me. The secret room! And I didn't know about it, because it was secret to everybody, except that once when I was just ready to go with my grandfather to take a trip to Princeton University in 1937, I was to go with him to his 60th reunion, and at the same time take my college entrance boards. Because in those days, boy, every member of the family just had to go to Princeton University, so there was never any question about what I was to do. I was to be shipped off there, and I was. Well, he said, we had dinner, and then he closed the curtains and said, well, now we're going to put away the family silverware. And he went over and pressed a button on a glass case in which there were a whole lot of china. This whole cupboard then swung out silently, and there was a room. And in the room was, of all things, the safety deposit boxes of the first bank in Cedar Rapids, with which he'd been associated, or his father had, I guess. And when the house was burned down, I knew about that secret room, and I thought I ought to salvage that thing. And I managed to balance these safety deposit boxes on a wheelbarrow, and it's still sitting in my garage now. I offered it to Henry Royer, and I said, if ever you want to push safety deposit boxes, well, I've got the original ones.